Test. Jörg, is audio on the stream? Test. Für ein nasty noise. Whatever. Strange noises. Ist drauf? Oh, läuft. All right. Then I just need to get online. That seems to work. Hold on a sec. Works. Fine. All right. 2 minutes. Okay. Ja. Ah, Kabelbruch. Jetzt Kabelbruch. Nee, das ist Kabel. Nee. Weiß ich nicht. Gucken wir mal. I hope it works. Ta-da. Test. All right. Jörg, when are we on air? Because we're all on TV. Well, you're not, I am, but. What? 1 minute? Ah, neat. Well, all right. So sorry about the crackling noise. This is like a broken cable somewhere here. I try to move a little less. Yeah, welcome to the spontaneous session about what's new in version 9 of Typo 3. We figured we'd just go through a couple of things that we picked because we have, like, I think more than 100 features merged in core. Some are more, or some have more impact than others. We just picked like a small best of, so you know. If you have any questions on any of these topics, just shout them out right away, because things tend to get lost. Otherwise, there's a lot of people from the core team here you can ask at any point in time. Cool. So, some stuff about things we improved in the backend in the recent versions. So first off, there's the switchback for the last used user in the switchback mode. You might know that you can impersonate another user in Typo 3's backend, and if you do stuff like editing permissions or something along those lines, you keep switching back and forth between two accounts all the time. What you now have in the same window where you have the logout button, you now have the possibility to switch back into the last user you had switched to. So this is very, very convenient if you want to switch back and forth. The next cool thing we have is that you can now add route parameters to Ajax routes in both backend and frontend, which is extremely helpful, and this wasn't possible before. We got a lot of debug information in Typo 3's backend, which is helpful. You see, for example, you have the titles of fields or the field names next to the label. You have the actual value displayed, even in database relations and stuff. Super helpful. In order to enable this, you need to be A, an admin user, and B, you need to enable backend debugging. So not all your editors will see all this debug information. And then we got a small but very, very helpful new signal that we have, which happens after login into the Typo 3 backend, that you can utilize to send emails, fire up a light, or call your mom, or whatever you want to do with that. This is in now. Then another very, very helpful thing that was requested quite often is that we have a button to duplicate a record. So you no longer need to go down the copy, paste, insert, find the record again route. You just have a duplicate button that you can enable via page.tsconfig. And another helpful thing is the search wizard in, the suggest wizard, that you have with a lot of database relations. It's a small field where you can type stuff in. Now allows for multi-term search. So you can basically search for site plus German, and you will get every page that has both words in them in whatever order. So this is helpful, for example, if you have a lot of customer data and you want to find that specific person real fast and you don't know whether the first name is actually in the right field. So pretty cool. More stuff that we have is that you can now browse the page.tsconfig of the currently logged in user, which is very helpful for debugging stuff in the backend as well. We added a couple of new, does it work? Yeah. A couple of new view helpers that you can use in your own backend modules to directly go to the edit view of a certain record and don't have to worry about back URL and stuff like that. That was always a hassle. And there's more to come from that. Very small but very helpful, at least in my opinion, is the copyright footnote on the backend login screen. You might have seen that. We did a video on it. It's that in the lower right corner of the backend login, you can provide a small text portion about copyrights. At least it's intended for copyrights. You can use it for a phone number or whatever text you want to show in the login. Next thing we cleared up and made easier to use is registration of your own navigational components in backend modules. This was a bit tricky with navframe ID and a couple more things you needed to know, and it wasn't really straightforward, and we just streamlined that. So registering your own navigation component is pretty simple now. Another thing, like, who uses palettes in TCA? Who hates doing it? More people than before. Awesome. Yeah, we hated that too. We made the palette syntax a bit easier. So there's no longer a colon-separated list of comma-separated values of dash div separated stuff. But there's more to come. We already have a work-in-progress dummy of a fully-fledged array notation, which makes more sense, having an array with an array instead of a string in an array. Yeah. Just to repeat the question for the stream, so yeah, the palette syntax is indeed only for palettes right now. The entire show item stuff, which is this huge string that everybody hates, and to be honest, I don't get why we have a string that we turn into an array during runtime, and the string is registered in an array. This is what we're cleaning up and fixing, so you can also just move stuff around in a more easier fashion. Then we have the ability to blind fields in the configuration view. So if you think passwords, you can now define certain values as blinded values, and you don't want to show passwords while browsing the configuration. And we no longer have the split safe button. Hold your horses. We also don't have a save and new button anymore. Nope. The save and delete stuff is something we really need to add in the future. And while you're laughing, this is actually not even a bad idea, because you could just change something to a record, save it, then it's in the log, and then you can delete it. No, but the entire save situation or the button bar situation is cleaned up as we are progressing towards removing the necessity to save at all. Because in the long run, we want to automatically save each and every change and then just have a huge publish button to get your changes live. But there's more to that, and we might demo that, I guess, just so everybody can see how it looks. Then we got a couple of changes in terms of database-related things. So first and foremost, we now support native datetime fields in each and every database, which is very helpful because this whole timestamp calculation madness is pretty 2002. Then another great thing is that restriction containers can now be extended at a central point. So if you do stuff like, I mean, Georg built this for the GDPR extension that adds yet another restriction to each and every query without the necessity that each and every front-end plugin actually changes their queries because the restrictions are applied anyways. And there's another great thing, which is mandatory restrictions, also coming from the GDPR background. These are restrictions that will not be removed if you call remove all, which sounds weird, but they're still in place. You can remove them, but you need to remove them explicitly. So this is some sort of security mechanism that mandatory restrictions are indeed applied to your queries. And another really, really cool thing that Typo3 now runs on SQLite, which doesn't sound like one of the biggest adventures that we needed to go, but we might speed up functional testing by quite a lot because we no longer need to import data sets. We can just put the SQLite database right in front of the functional test, and this should speed up stuff by a huge margin. Then there's a couple of changes to XBase, which I know nothing about, but somebody else might find those helpful. So what we do have is a new validator that basically validates URLs in your models, which should come in handy. We have the a doctrine compatible, or no, it's indeed the doctrine, right? Validation annotations. And then we have a couple of new validators for file size, and we added a new doctrine compatible. Is it compatible? We just doctrine style annotation for lazy loading, for transients, and for cascading, which means that basically it behaves like your average doctrine project, aka Symfony. Well, Laravel doesn't use it, right? They do their own stuff, but you might find a lot of things more intuitive, especially if you switch between projects. This is like a huge time saver. Then we got a couple of things for the front end. We'll start with the obvious stuff. So you can now load your JavaScript libraries deferred by adding the async attribute. Then we have a brand new meta tag API, which doesn't sound like such a big thing, but I don't know if that ever happened to you, but has a client ever requested you to change the page title depending on the current detail view? That's a pain, right? This basically no longer is. So in terms of meta tags, what we now have are meta tag containers that different extensions can override, write stuff into, and at a final stage, you can load your own meta tag container that then cleans up stuff or overrides stuff. It works with multiple OG image tags, for example, which then has a weird syntax of if you have two images, you need two width definitions right after that, and it takes care of all these things. So this is pretty helpful. Another small thing, but what I consider extremely helpful, is that the debug output that you can enable in the front end by config.debug was these two HTML comments at the bottom of the file, which showed the parse time and I think the point in time when the page was put into cache. These were HTML comments, which is super unhelpful if you have JSON data that you output, because suddenly your JSON is no longer valid. So we decided to put these things basically into HTTP headers, which also makes it easier to just have your monitoring system regularly ping the site and take a look at the header data for parse times and caches, etc. Another helpful thing is language menus. So multi-site language menus now are created out of the box by Typo3 for you. So you no longer need this, I think user dev1 was page is not available in current language, user dev2 was active state or something along those lines. So we built brand new language menus which you can just use out of the box. The Bootstrap package uses them already. And these work together with the new sites module that we're going to talk about a bit later. Then we have a brand new admin panel, which basically has been rewritten from scratch, which not only does no longer create this extremely long get parameter madness and behind the URL, so it works with Ajax, you no longer need the reloads, but it does a couple more impressive things. So for example, you will be able to see all the hooks that are available on that page together with those that were actually used. And this is like super helpful information. You can turn fluid debugging on and off. So you will get small overlays on your fluid template so you can see the actual paths and where stuff comes from. There's more to that. Susie, help me out. SQL queries that are being executed are aggregated by their usage and the parameters they were using. So you could have the same query running with a different parameter set. You can see all this in the admin panel. So this should be really, really helpful when debugging front-end stuff. What else? It's pluggable. That's new. So you can now register your own stuff into the admin panel as well, which is also, or should be pretty helpful, I guess. Another thing we added was the inline SVG content element, which is helpful if you want to apply CSS styles to an SVG that you can run, so to recolor icons or whatever. And we brought back progressive image loading. So for those who don't know what that is, back in the days when I was young, images were loading in like a low-res version, and then they were progressively re-rendered as they got more crisp. And this is basically stuff that we now re-enabled in ImageMagick and GraphicsMagick. So, moving onwards to Fluid. Fluid got a couple of new things. So the select view helper can finally be mandatory after all these years. Yeah, you can now add parameters to YouTube and Vimeo videos in the view helper, which was often requested, stuff like autoplay, loop, all these kind of things, which was like a super annoying additional parameters section going on. These are now supported natively. If you're using the translate view helper, the language you want to actually get the translation from can now be explicitly defined. So it's no longer defined by the controller context necessarily. So you can basically override which language you want to take the label from, helpful from language menus. Then we have the possibility to explicitly disable fluid debugging. So you can go into your fluid templates and basically say, okay, render partial XYZ debug false, which means that the fluid debugging overlay will be disabled for this specific instance of a file, which is also pretty helpful. Then we have the link to a module view helper, which is which basically, no, that should be in the backend stuff, right? This is not front-end related. Right, it's Fluid, backend stuff as well. That was close. So linking to a module should be a lot easier from your own backend modules now. And then we got the new resource view helper, which is also rendering stuff like inline SVGs, etc. Also pretty helpful. All pictures taken? Okay, I can share those as well, right? You don't, okay. Then moving on to Xform, which learned a couple of new tricks. And Ralph is here if there's anything you want to ask in terms of form. So form now has proper validation messages in form, right? Cool. There's a lot of HTML5 fields now natively supported by form, so you no longer have to extend the form framework to get that going. We have a click that doesn't work. We have conditions for fields, which is very helpful if you have like multi-step forms and stuff you want to do. Not necessarily just forms related, but also pretty cool is that we now support email spooling, which is pretty helpful. If you have like a lot of emails to send, you can just put stuff in spool. And it supports basically everything what SwiftMailer supports. So you can have like a file system-based spool, some external spool. which goes together in conjunction with a scheduler task, which will then start sending the emails from that spool if you don't want to use an external service for that. And finally, the translations in ext form are now capable of getting arguments. Yes, awesome. Then we have a couple of general things which don't really fit into any category, but are also pretty helpful. So you can now define a central reply to email address in Typo-3's core that SwiftMailer will automatically apply to any email in case your developer forgets to do it. This is pretty helpful, so you no longer get empty reply to emails. I think it's also sent from. It was 2 settings, so it says reply to and send from, which you can now set centrally in default configuration. Then we now support password encryption in both bcrypt and Argon 2i, which, as far as I'm aware, I'm sneaking to Helmut, is good. Then we added a new generic environment class in order to get rid of general utility get-inf to grasp data. And I think this is the groundwork for Typo-3 learning a couple more tricks in terms of your overall environment that you can control. Then we have feature toggles. This basically enables us in core to ship new functionality while not dropping old functionality. So to take a drastic example, imagine we would delete XBase's persistence layer and replace it with Doctrine. Everybody would be happy until you install your own old extension, which suddenly breaks. And feature toggles enable us basically to turn features within Typo-3 on or off at a central place. So you can basically run both technologies at the same time, so we have a proper phasing out period. Yeah, that's a big one, which basically deserves a page on its own. So the table pages language overlay is gone, which means that pages now behave like every other localized overlaid record in Typo-3's core. And I think Benny spent a good 2 months on finding all the issues with that. But this actually makes stuff a lot easier. And finally, we got rid of NPM and moved all the stuff over to Yarn because NPM has a weird idea of how dependency trees work, which doesn't really fit our idea of how it works. But this should make things a lot easier. Plus, personally, I think Yarn feels faster than NPM because it just downloads like a quarter of the internet. So that works too. Then we got some stuff which should ease maintenance for your sites. First and foremost, if the click works. We have the new extension scanner in the maintenance module. Has anyone seen that thing already? Okay. Anyone not seen it? Cool. So what it basically does, it scans your extension, your own extension code for API violations or stuff that we removed from core, and will find those matches and tell you what you need to fix where in your code. And this should be super helpful for upgrading projects, even doing calculations, because you can see beforehand how much stuff would need to be changed in order to get the migration done. Pretty damn awesome. Another cool thing is that we now, yeah. Cover, yeah. So the question is, which API changes does the extension scanner know so far? So we checked all the changes between 8 and 9 currently. And I think there's a third-party back. What was that? The backport? Okay. At least it's possible to include more changes. I do know of someone who actually built this to cover the changes between version 7 and version 8, or 7, 8, 9 in that case, of course. I don't know if it's public yet. We're not entirely sure, but I can ask. We can get that done. Yeah, back to system maintainers. There's a couple of good reasons to give your client admin access to the install. There's a couple more reasons not to. And what system maintainers now enables you is to define somebody who has access to the maintenance module, upgrade wizards, extension manager, these kind of things. By default, the very first created user that you have will become a system maintainer. So that person can basically log into the install tool, which is now the maintenance module, and twins. And any other admin user created after that will not be able to access these functionalities. So they have full control over their content and over their users. They can do all these kind of things, but they're not able to alter important stuff in the system. They will be able to create TypoScript templates, though. So keep in mind that they could just include a PHP file from someplace. But this is very, very helpful. Another thing which goes into the same direction of having strings of arrays in an array was the extension configuration, which was a serialized PHP array as a string registered in an array, which doesn't really make sense. So these are now just plain array storage, or basically plain array notation directly in your local configuration file or additional configuration file. Then we shortened the TypoScript import syntax. So anyone in the audience who gets the TypoScript file import syntax from memory? Something with include, underscore, whatever. What you can now do is just type @import in the YAML way of doing stuff, and it basically just shortens down the lines, and it's more straightforward. Yes, please. I think so, but I'm not entirely sure. We had this discussion before. You can include directories, but I'm not sure if you can provide the file suffix any longer. I don't know exactly. Conditions for importing? I doubt it. Put it in a condition block. It's the same thing. It's open source. Fix it. Right. Then something we're really thrilled about is PSR 15 middlewares, which basically means if you take a look at the standard front-end rendering process, there's a lot of things going on. So you need to determine the domain, you need to determine the current page ID, find stuff, check if somebody's logged in, etc. And this was very, very dated code. I think that's the proper term to put it. And these are now extracted into proper PSR 15 middlewares that work with the data and hand over the data to the next middleware. And I don't know if it's possible yet, but at least I do know that it's planned that you can disable certain middlewares. So for example, if you're 100% sure that you will never need logged-in front-end users in the site, just disable the middleware so Typo3 won't even check for that. And this is pretty helpful. Then we did huge progress on the PSR 7 stuff. And I think we're pretty close to finishing it. That basically means that we have a proper request response model in Typo3's core, which at least to me didn't really show why it's so super helpful. But imagine that you can just build and request object of a front-end request on command line, and Typo3 will behave exactly as you would expect it to behave. So you basically can simulate the entire front-end request with get parameters, user agent, date of time, remote IP, whatever, and Typo3 will react in the exact same way without the necessity to jump through hoops. So this is like, I'm super thrilled about that. And I think that was Georg, added interval presets to scheduler so that you can now define certain presets of the interval. in which scheduler runs. So you no longer need to remember cron style syntax, which is like */12 call mom, stuff like I never got it. It's always the website I use to set up stuff like that. Or I ask Lolly because he knows by heart. But you can now just provide presets for that, which should be helpful in setting up more stuff. Then we got a couple of things which are what we call forward-facing. So this is stuff that's interesting for editors, for marketers, etc. And this starts with a ton of new SEO fields, which ship natively from core, and they come with a native front-end rendering right out of the box. So this should basically remove the necessity to use third-party SEO plugins to get your site SEO ready. Another cool thing is that the backend now has toggle switches that you can utilize for your own fields. So that's if you have like a checkbox value, true, false, there's a couple of different renderings that you can choose from. So you still have the checkbox style, but you also have like a toggle switch style, and there's even a label toggle, which turns green or red, depending on its current state. And these can be inverted. So if we take the example I like the most in TYPO3's core is the checkbox in the pages properties. Disable in search, yes. Which is like the mother of unintuitive to everyone. So what we can do now is we can basically invert that state and argue that the page is enabled in search, even though the value in the database is false. So this is very helpful. Or hide page instead of is page active, right? So these kind of things, very, very helpful. The search in the file module now searches not only in the file name, but also in the entire table for sysfile metadata, which is also that has been requested quite often. We got that stuff done now. Then we have the auto update notification right from the backend, so you no longer need to go to maintenance module to check whether your TYPO3 site runs the latest version. This is in the information panel. I think that's the official name. The thing on the top right, which will basically check whether your TYPO3 installation runs latest patch version, stuff like that. And then we got the redirect extension, which is also pretty helpful because you no longer need to fiddle around with htaccess files or set up stuff in your Nginx configuration. This is shipped by now. And the sites module, which is also a new thing, which basically takes care about everything regarding your site, your package, the website. So this is what I want to talk about now for a minute or two. So what we consider site management is a combination of a couple of things. So first off, it's about speaking URLs. And Benny is doing great progress on getting this done so that you have speaking URLs from core right out of the box. The main difference between the speaking URL approach that the core will provide and real URL is that real URL basically guesses what you might want to see. And this is very, very problematic. It works on simple scenarios. If things get complicated, real URL just breaks. What we will be using in core is that you will basically seeing the explicit URL stored with the page record at every point in time. And you will be able to change these. What's cool is that you can, you can let the system determine whether the change you just did to one page might affect multiple pages later down the route line. So if you change the name of a page from products to our products, TYPO3 will basically ask the editor if this change should be applied to all child pages of that page as well. And if the editor suggests that, yes, I want to do these changes, TYPO3 will then ask, well, shall I create redirects for that so that your SEO ranking doesn't go south? So this is the speaking URL part. Redirects is something we just covered in that part. You had a question? So I just repeat the question because TV. So the question was how basically speaking URLs for controller, remote controlling controllers, that's basically it, right? How that's going to work. I did see a very, very early demo, so it might work in the way, and I'm not sure if Benny is continuing on that approach because there's a lot of trial and error. But the idea is that you have a dedicated resolver per extension that you can then A, configure, and B, also move around in order between sites. So this was the first approach we had. So we're going to take a look at the sites module in a minute, and then I can basically point a finger to where we imagine these slug generators to be. But these can be configured per site. That's the important part. Unlike real URL, which basically had the central configuration which applied to all sites in all languages. Does that kind of help? Georg? The question was whether it's not possible to have speaking URLs for news. I'm pretty sure with the release that news might sport a slug resolver. So there's... Yeah. Yeah, of course. But only for that small segment behind the... So the basic page URL, that's handled by core, and extensions can then have their own resolvers for that stuff. Cool. Yeah, so site management, back to topic, consists of speaking URLs, redirects, templates, it's also part of site, content elements, which should be specific to a site, not specific to the entire installation. So imagine you have like a multi-brand site, and they need specialized content elements for brand A, which are not necessary in brand B. So what you do is you configure those away via page.tsconfig. We think it might make more sense to just register content elements in per site. So if you set up a new site, you can basically say this site uses that template and needs this, this, and that content element, and you're done. And does this work? Sorry. Yeah, so site management obviously requires sites, but also link management. So link validator will become like a first-class citizen of the module tree, because right now it's hidden somewhere in web info, drop down, whatever. And link validator is basically rewritten from scratch to supply more help and be easier to use. So that's the idea behind site management in total. Anyone care to see how the sites module looks? Okay, cool. Aha, so if the slideshow works. So, that should be sufficient in size, I guess. So, we'll just take a look at some small random page I created. This has a TypoScript template, which has, I'm going to disable these two because they're not necessary. So this is like the most basic TypoScript you can imagine to get a site running. And what you can see up top, by the way, is the new button bar. So I'm going to save that. After that, I close it and I'm done. So what I have now is I go to the sites module. And what you can see is that it basically identified 2 sites based on the page tree. And the identification mechanism is basically the is_site_root field that you have in the page properties. So finally, it does something more than show a globe icon. The good thing is, in this demo, you can see that we basically have my other site, which is nested in the tree in this area in the microsites, nested microsites, my other site. So this is how sites are basically identified for the sites module. And if we get back to it, we can see that we now have the site configured right here, and we can edit this. So we have a pretty huge form. What you need to have in the first place is a site identifier. This is something internal, unique, you need to set up to, well, identify the site. The root page ID is set automatically. It's just there to give you a little bit of orientation where you are in the tree. And then you can define a so-called entry point. And entry points are basically the new sysdomain records. So you define the entry point. In this case, it's typo3-core.lcl because that's my local domain. And I'm good to go. And then we have language handling. And what you can see here up on top are all languages available in the system. So sys language records that you created that are not yet used in the bottom language configuration. So if we take a look at what language configuration actually does, is that you have a language ID to select, obviously. You create a language title for it internally, which is by default used by the language menus that we talked about earlier. You can override it for the navigation title as well, if you want to have something different in your local menu. And the interesting thing is that you can see that here's another entry point. And this entry point can either be a fully fledged domain or just a small path segment. And I can show you that in a minute, or I'll just show it right now. So you see the different variants that we have on the right-hand side. So you see that we have the typo3-core.lcl, and we have typo3-core.lcl/dk, which is just a path prefix that we're using for the Danish language. And the third entry basically shows that this is, again, a fully fledged domain. So this doesn't have to be a subdomain. It could be a completely different domain that you could use for that. And typo3 will basically derive all the language information from that part and automatically set sys language UID, the condition stuff that you need in TypoScript before. You no longer need to do those things because you configure those here. So moving on from the entry point, you now have the language locale, which is used for the HTML attack. You have like the 2-letter ISO code, which I'm not entirely sure why it's in, but I think it's just the HTML, the opening HTML tag, if I'm not mistaken. Then there's a couple more things in terms for the lang and hreflang attributes. You can define the direction of text. You can select which local lang file language key should be used for that language. Switch these things. You can select the icon, obviously, which works for both the language menu, if you want to use it, as well as for configuring the language in the backend as well. This isn't in yet, but this is the future plan, that everything language related to sites, both backend and frontend, is configured from here. So say you have 40 languages in the entire install, and the site just needs 3, you just configure this once. So no more fiddling with page tsconfig at different places, which is tough to deploy. Yes, please. In the long run, yes. In the short run, no. So I'm short on time. OK, I'll just rush through to get these things done. Next up is error handling. So you can manage all your error handling on a per-site level. And error handling works in a way that it basically catches error status codes. And you can then define how these status codes should be managed. Again, if you have a multi-site installation, you had like one way to register for a for handler in core in the install tool, right? So this has now been moved into the site-based error handler, and there's a couple of ones available. So the first we have is basically just a fluid template that you can use. This fluid template will be enriched with request information, current language, et cetera, so you can react to the 404 page. The next thing is what used to be the redirect, which makes little sense because you lost the URL in the process. So the 404 triggered and redirected you to someplace else, and you lost the original URL. So what it now does is that it shows content from a different page, because that's most likely what you want to have. And if nothing else helps, you have a PHP class that then gets the request object, and you can do whatever you want to do with that. So this entire setup that we have defined here in this form is enough to run a 3-language page with 2 lines of TypoScript. And now you could argue, well, that's all cool and great, but now you store all the stuff in the database because it's a Typo3 form, right? Nope, because these are YAML files being generated from Typo3 backend forms via TCA. And if you let that sink in for a second, you will realize, okay, so Typo3 can write to a different persistence layer other than local MySQL or the local database. And this is something we're exploring right now. So imagine you would have Typo3 forms on top of a REST API, which would be possible to do with these things. So you can use all the editing power that TCA gives you and work with basically any other data source. And this is like really, really helpful. I'm short on time. I got like -1 minute. But I'm still here for the entire night. Does it work? Go on. Right. So this is where Susie basically tells me about initiatives. Awesome. So another thing we changed in the core, which is not necessarily code related, but more operations related, is that we now have initiatives, which are strategic teams, I think you could call them, that work on certain topics. And anybody is invited to join any of these initiatives, or multiple if you have a lot of spare time. So the initiatives we have as of today are the routing initiative, which is speaking URLs mainly, and Benny could use a lot of help. We have the admin panel initiative. We have an accessibility initiative, which is all about accessibility in both front and back end alike. We have a data handler and persistence initiative. This is basically everything about data storage, data retrieval. We have the SEO initiative by basically Richard Hazer from MaxServe. We have the GDPR initiative by yours truly, Georg Ringer. And we have the form framework initiative represented by Ralph. So, thanks. Any more questions? So, I'm sorry, we're out of time. No, no. The thing is that so the question was, what about front-end editing? So front-end editing is in a shape that we want to do a final code review in order to merge that, and this task fell to Benny Mac as well, and we figured that speaking URLs is more important than that. So Benny will hopefully finish the work on speaking URL and routing in the near future. Fingers crossed. And after that, basically do the review for front-end editing. And Benji Cott will do a rebrush of the visual appeal of it. So he will be starting to work at Typo3 Inc. as of next week. And then one of his tasks is to take a look at the front-end editing visual stuff, because it kind of looks weird. So that's the current state on that. We basically had to prioritize, and we figured speaking URLs more important than having front-end editing. Cool. Anything else? That was quick. All right. So, we got the question stuff. It's also awesome. So, enjoy the day. We're here.